There exists a silence deeper than death, the silence of those who chose never to speak. The cemetery of St. Erasmus held no living visitors after dusk. Elena knew this with the certainty of someone who had spent 17 years learning the rhythms of the dead. Her fingers, stained perpetually with wax and earth, moved with ritualistic precision as she lit candles above the unmarked graves, the forgotten ones, the suicides, the strangers who had no one to remember their names. She had been mute since the fever took her voice at age 4. The orphanage sisters said it was God's mercy. The children said it was a curse. Elena said nothing. Words were unnecessary in the presence of the dead. The candles flickered tonight with unusual vigor, as if responding to an invisible wind. Elena paused, her dark eyes lifting toward the iron gate where the living world ended. The October air carried something unfamiliar, not rain, not rot, but a presence that made her skin contract like wet leather. He emerged from the mist as though he had always been there, waiting. The man was tall, impossibly composed, dressed in a coat that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His face was angular, almost carved from marble, and his eyes held centuries the way old wells hold water, deep, cold, reflecting nothing. He did not walk so much as materialize between the gravestones, his movements containing a predatory grace that made Elena's breath shallow. She should have been afraid. Every instinct in her fractured childhood screamed to run. Instead, she remained motionless, candle raised like an offering. "You light candles for the damned," he said. His voice was soft, textured like velvet worn thin, carrying an accent she could not place, something Eastern, something ancient. "I have watched you for 3 weeks, always at sunset, always the same graves." Elena's throat contracted. She opened her mouth, remembering too late that no sound would come. The shame of it, the desperate, familiar shame of her voicelessness, burned through her. The vampire smiled, and it was a gesture so sad it seemed to carry the weight of ages. "You cannot speak, neither can I, truly, not any more. Words became ornaments I stopped wearing centuries ago." He moved closer, and Elena did not retreat. There was something in his immobility, in the acceptance of her silence, that felt like recognition, like homecoming. "I am Dmitri," he continued, kneeling beside one of the unmarked graves. "I have not spoken my name aloud in 200 years. But you, small one, you deserve to know who stands in the presence of your mercy." Elena watched as he placed his pale hand against the cold stone. For a moment, something flickered across his face, anguish so profound it seemed to age him and renew him simultaneously. "I was searching for a victim," he said quietly. "The hunger had become unbearable. I smelled your blood on the wind, young, untouched, warm. I came to feed." He turned to her, and his eyes were luminous with something that might have been tears, though she knew vampires could not cry. "But instead, I found you lighting candles for people no one remembers, and I realized I have forgotten how to remember anyone." Elena's hands trembled. She set down her candle and, with movements that felt predetermined, reached toward him. Her palm met the place where his heart would have beaten, if hearts like his still harbored such ordinary miracles. Dmitri closed his eyes. Under her touch, he seemed to fracture and reassemble, as though her living warmth was remaking him at the molecular level. "The hunger never truly leaves," he whispered. "But perhaps there are other hungers, hungers for connection, for witness, for someone to see you as more than the monster you have become." Elena could not speak her response, but her eyes spoke it. She would stay. She would light candles with him. She would sit in the graves of the forgotten and ensure that 2 souls, one living, one undead, would never be completely alone in their silence. As midnight approached, Dmitri rose and extended his hand. Elena took it without hesitation and felt the cold of eternity seep into her living warmth. It did not frighten her. Instead, It felt like the first honest thing she had ever touched. Behind them, the candles burned lower, casting their light upward into a sky that suddenly felt less infinite and more intimate, as if the stars themselves had leaned down to witness what was beginning in the darkness. The old monastery on the hill had belonged to Dmitri for 134 years. Elena discovered this fact through observation alone, the way he moved through its corridors as though his footsteps had worn grooves into the stone itself. The building breathed with his presence, cold, deliberate, haunted not by ghosts but by accumulated solitude. She had been living within its walls for 2 weeks. Communication between them had evolved into something beyond language. Dmitri read her expressions as though they were illuminated manuscripts. Elena had learned to understand the precise angle of his jaw when hunger threatened to overtake reason, the softening of his eyes when she traced the old scars mapping his forearms. Souvenirs from a life lived before immortality had refined him into something almost elegant. Tonight, he had promised to tell her the truth. The candle between them burned steadily, casting their shadows enormous and distorted against the stone walls. Elena sat across from him at a table that had hosted centuries of meals he no longer ate. "I was human once," Dmitri began, his voice measured like a physician delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Born in Sofia, 1687, I was a surgeon, small hands, steady fingers, an inability to accept death as final. When plague came, I watched my entire family hollow out like candles burned from the inside. My wife, my 3 children, my mother. I could do nothing but watch their lungs fill with fluid and their skin blacken." He paused, and Elena saw him swallow, a human gesture, practiced, perhaps mourned. "There was a woman who came to the hospital where I worked. She was beautiful in the way that made you understand beauty was a curse, not a gift. She had been alive for 400 years. She came to me fevered, seeming almost mortal, and I treated her without knowing what she was. When I discovered the truth, I asked her to transform me. Not out of love, I was too hollow for love. Out of defiance, I wanted to prove that death was not the end." Elena reached across the table and placed her fingers against his wrist. His pulse was absent, but she felt something else. A vibration, subtle as a tuning fork, struck in an empty room. "The transformation is not transcendence," Dmitri continued. "It is amputation. You lose the ability to feel sunlight, to taste food, to experience the basic temperatures of human existence. You gain hunger that is never satisfied and an infinity that becomes a prison. I have lived long enough to watch empires crumble and rise. I have watched languages die. I have watched humans forget entire centuries of their own history. And I have remained, unchanging, unmade, unable to finish what death had started." Elena's eyes filled with tears. She understood then that his confession was not merely history, it was a wound still bleeding after centuries. "But you," Dmitri said, and his voice shifted, softened, became something almost fragile. "You came to the cemetery lighting candles for people no one remembers. You chose kindness in the absence of obligation. You chose to honor the forgotten, and for the first time in 200 years, I felt the hunger transform into something else. A hunger to protect, to witness, to be witnessed by someone who had already chosen to see the value in the invisible." Elena stood and moved toward him. Without fear, without hesitation, she tilted her head, exposing the soft architecture of her neck. An offering, a choice. Dmitri's entire body went rigid. She felt his struggle, the predator at war with the man, the monster at war with the lover. "No," he whispered, and the word cost him something immeasurable. "Not like this, not in hunger. If I taste you, Elena, I need it to be something else. I need it to mean something that transcends survival." Elena withdrew, understanding. She returned to her seat, and for hours they sat in silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of two people communicating in a language deeper than sound. By dawn, Elena had learned the most important truth, that Dimitri's suffering was not a punishment. It was a choice he made every moment to remain human, in the only way remaining to him, through restraint, through love that did not consume. The candle burned lower, and neither of them extinguished it. Winter arrived with the kind of brutality that suggested the season itself had been starved. Elena had begun exploring the monastery's abandoned wings, discovering rooms frozen in time, a nursery with toys no child had touched in centuries, a library where books had become dust-shaped like literature, a bedroom where Dimitri had once slept before sleep became impossible. It was in the tower chamber that she found the mirror. The glass was ancient, its surface mapped with age spots like a diseased lung. In its reflection, Elena saw herself, still young, still living, still radiating the small heat that made her valuable. And beside her reflection, nothing. Dimitri did not cast an image. He was present and absent simultaneously. "Do you understand now?" His voice came from the darkness beyond the mirror's reach. "This is what I see every day, the absence of proof that I exist. No reflection, no shadow in certain lights, no mirror self to confirm that I am more than appetite and memory." Elena turned and found him standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray window light. She moved toward him, and taking his hand, placed it against her own chest. She could feel his trembling, not from fear, but from the effort of his restraint. She began to undress. Dimitri's breath caught, a sound so rarely heard that it seemed to reverberate through the stone itself. But he did not move toward her with hunger. Instead, he watched as she revealed the landscape of her body, pale skin, the delicate architecture of ribs, the softness of vulnerability. When she was bare, she took his hand and guided it across her shoulders, down her spine, across the hollow of her stomach. Understanding bloomed across his face like a shadow receding. "You want to be proof of me," she whispered into the silence, her voicelessness making the gesture even more intimate. Dimitri nodded and with infinite gentleness traced a line across her sternum with one cold finger. He was marking her, not with teeth, but with the shape of his touch, creating evidence of his existence on the only mirror that had ever reflected him, her skin, her living, breathing canvas. They did not make love in the traditional sense. Instead, they created a ritual, his cold against her warmth, his absence meeting her presence, two forms of incompleteness finding something approaching wholeness in the intersection of their need. When it was over, Elena lay across the ancient bed, and Dimitri remained beside her without touching, his eyes tracing the marks his hands had made, proof that he could affect the world, that he was not merely a dream someone was having. "I want to show you something," Elena wrote on the dust-covered table with her finger. She had learned to communicate through writing when urgency required it. She led him to a mirror in the tower and showed him what he refused to see, that in her eyes his reflection existed perfectly, that his absence from the glass was meaningless because she carried his image in her memory, in her skin, in the changed rhythm of her heartbeat. Dimitri looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, as though he was beginning to understand that immortality might not be a curse if shared with someone who chose to see you as more than your hunger, your absence, your endless night. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. 3 months into their strange cohabitation, Elena began to understand that love between a mortal and immortal was not a romance. It was a haunting that moved in both directions simultaneously. Dimitri had started taking her into the village at night, always careful to keep her in shadow, always positioning himself between her and the other living souls who moved through the darkness. He never explained why he brought her to these places until one night, standing at the edge of a town square, he whispered his confession. I wanted to remember what it meant to exist among the living. I have spent so long in isolation that I had begun to believe I was the only conscious creature on earth. But with you beside me, I can feel the texture of the world again, the complexity, the tragedy. They watched a woman weeping on a bench, her shoulders curved inward like a plant withdrawing from drought. Elena felt Dimitri's body tense beside her, not with hunger, but with empathy. He understood suffering. He had become fluent in its language over centuries. That woman, Dimitri said softly, has just received news that her daughter will not survive the winter. The doctors have given her 3 months. She is calculating how many birthdays she will miss, how many conversations will go unfinished. She is experiencing the beginning of eternity, the knowledge that time stretches ahead without the person you love. And she will never know that I understand this completely, that I have lived long enough to know that grief is the price of love. And it is always, always worth paying. Elena took his hand, and they stood in witness together, two beings separated by the chasm between mortality and eternity, connected by the recognition that suffering was the only truly universal language. The hunger inside Dimitri had transformed. It no longer sought blood, it sought meaning, it sought witness. It sought to understand why humans continued to love despite the guarantee of loss, continued to hope despite the evidence of futility. I think, Dimitri said as they returned to the monastery, that immortality was meant to teach me something. Not that life is precious. I knew that as a human. But that love is an act of defiance. That choosing to care about someone mortal, knowing they will die, knowing you will continue alone, is the most courageous thing an immortal can do. Elena stopped walking and turned to face him. In the moonlight, she could see his face clearly. The beauty of him was no longer terrible. It had become tender. She touched his mouth with her fingers and opened her own, creating a shape with her lips. I love you. Dimitri understood. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, not a claim, but a benediction. A recognition that she had saved him from something worse than hunger, the erosion of his capacity to care. That night, as they lay together in the tower chamber, Elena felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not regret, but a deepening awareness that her choice to remain with him was also a choice to begin the long process of learning to say goodbye. She would age. She would weaken. She would eventually face the same mortality that had shaped all her days before Dimitri arrived, and he would remain, forever young, forever haunted, forever carrying the memory of the girl who lit candles for the forgotten and saw eternity not as a curse, but as an opportunity to love one more day. The spring brought Elena her first serious illness, a fever that made her skin glow with an internal fire that terrified Dimitri in ways he had not experienced in centuries. He refused to leave her side. He sat in the candlelit chamber, watching her sleep, her breathing shallow and irregular, her body burning through itself like a candle consumed by its own flame. And for the first time in 200 years, Dimitri felt the weight of his choice to remain alive and conscious. You could turn me, Elena wrote on paper, her hand barely steady. Make me like you. Make this stop. Dimitri read the words and experienced something like despair. He had known this question would come. He had rehearsed his answer in the silence of his endless nights, trying to prepare himself for the moment when her love would demand the ultimate transformation. If I do this, he said, sitting beside her, you lose everything that makes you yourself. You lose the sun, the warmth of human food, the ability to be surprised by the taste of new wine or the texture of fresh bread. You lose the possibility of genuine death, which is the only true mercy that awaits all living things. You would inherit my curse and believe it was redemption because you would inherit it with me. But in 50 years, When you have watched the same stars repeat their patterns endless times, when you have seen enough death to understand that it is not the enemy, but the punctuation that gives life meaning, you will resent me. You will resent the eternity I gave you. Elena closed her eyes, tears sliding down her fevered face. I will not do this to you, Dmitri continued, his voice fractured. I love you too much to make you immortal. Instead, I will love you through your mortality. I will witness every year as it marks your face. I will feel your eventual death like an amputation, and I will deserve that pain. It will be the price of having loved someone brave enough to choose a finite life with an infinite man. Elena opened her eyes and tried to speak, a habit her voicelessness had not broken, and Dmitri leaned close to catch the ghost of her words. How do you bear it, she tried to say, knowing I will leave you? By understanding that you never truly leave, Dmitri whispered. Every moment with you becomes a memory I will carry forever. You will age and die. But I will remain the same, which means I will remain young enough to remember you exactly as you are now. Forever will be you. That is not a curse. That is the only immortality that matters. By midnight, Elena's fever broke. She slept deeply, her body having fought its way back to health. Dmitri remained awake, as he always did, and made a silent vow to the darkness. He would cherish every moment of her mortality as though it were more precious than eternity, because he had finally understood the truth that only an immortal could fully comprehend. Death gives life its meaning. And love, real love, was not a promise to stay forever. It was a choice to stay fully present for however long forever allowed. By autumn, Elena had become legend in the village. The girl who had emerged from the old monastery. The girl who had befriended the solitary man in the tower. The girl who moved through the world with the grace of someone who had looked into the abyss and chosen love instead of fear. People whispered about her in the market. The priest wondered about her in his prayers, and the village children followed her like she was a story made flesh. She had regained some of her capacity to vocalize, soft, fractured sounds, but sounds nonetheless, and she used them sparingly, making every utterance carry weight. Dmitri watched from the shadows and understood that she had become a bridge between his world and theirs. She was the proof that the impossible was real, that eternal darkness could love finite light, and that the most profound transformations happened in silence. One evening, a young man from the village came to the monastery door. His name was Thomas, and he carried a rifle. I know what you are, he said to Dmitri, and his voice carried the terrible certainty of someone who had been reading forbidden books. The villagers suspect. The priest has warned them. You are an abomination against God's natural order. Dmitri did not move. His face remained perfectly composed, though Elena, watching from behind a pillar, felt him gathering centuries of weariness around himself like armor. I am many things, Dmitri replied calmly, but I have harmed no one in this village. I have fed only on the animals that would be hunted anyway. I have asked nothing of your community except to be left in peace. You've taken Elena, Thomas said, raising the rifle. That's theft of the most profound kind. She deserves a human life, human children, a human grave. Elena stepped forward then, her small body moving between the two men. She looked at Dmitri with an expression of such tenderness and finality that everyone in the room seemed to stop breathing. Then she did something she had never done before. She spoke. Her voice was rough, barely functional, like stone grinding against stone, but the words emerged with devastating clarity. He gave me everything, she said. Choice. Thomas lowered the rifle, and in his face, Elena saw the recognition that she had already made her decision and that no bullet could change it. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. 3 years had passed since Elena first arrived at the monastery. The seasons had turned their wheel multiple times, and with each rotation, something had shifted fundamentally in the architecture of her existence. She was no longer the frightened orphan girl who lit candles for the nameless dead. She had become something more complex, more haunted, more luminous, a woman who carried within her the weight of understanding what it meant to love something that could never truly die. Dmitri watched her change with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every line that appeared on her face, every subtle deepening of her eyes, every moment where she seemed to access a wisdom she had not possessed before. All of it fascinated him in ways that centuries of immortal existence had not prepared him for. He found himself studying her the way a scholar studies an ancient text, searching for meanings hidden in plain sight. Tonight was different. Elena had insisted on returning to the cemetery, the place where their story had begun. She had dressed carefully, in a gown that had belonged to someone from Dmitri's distant past. A garment so old it seemed to carry its own history in its threads. The fabric was deep burgundy, the color of old wine and older blood, and it moved around her body like water taking the shape of a vessel. Dmitri drove her through the darkness in a car purchased 3 years ago, but rarely used. The night was crystalline, the stars so numerous they seemed almost obscene in their abundance. As they drove, Elena traced patterns on the window with her fingers, creating temporary maps that disappeared almost as quickly as they were formed. "Do you remember?" she asked, her voice still rough but growing stronger with each passing month. The vocal cords that had been silent for so long were learning to sing again, though they would never quite recover their full range. There was something beautiful in this incompleteness. It made every word she spoke feel like a miracle. "I remember everything," Dmitri replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "I have lived long enough to understand that memory is the closest thing to immortality that humans possess. Every moment with you has been burned into my consciousness in a way that physical eternity never could achieve." They arrived at the cemetery as midnight approached. The iron gates hung open. Elena had taken to keeping them unlocked, believing that the dead should not be sealed away from the living, that boundaries between worlds were artificial constructs designed to comfort the living rather than serve any actual purpose. The graves Elena had tended for years were immaculate. Fresh flowers, roses and lilies, chrysanthemums and forget-me-nots adorned each stone. The candles had been replaced with small lanterns that would burn longer, providing steadier light. It was as if the cemetery itself had been transformed into a cathedral, and the forgotten dead had been elevated to the status of saints worthy of veneration. Dmitri led Elena to the center of this sacred space, to a clearing where the moonlight fell with particular intensity. He had brought something with him, a box, ancient and leather-bound, its surface worn smooth by centuries of handling. "Before I transform," he said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he had been preparing this speech for a very long time, "I want you to understand what you are choosing, not the romanticism of it, not the poetry, the actual physical, metaphysical reality of what it means to become what I am." Elena's eyes widened. She had asked this question once, years ago, and Dmitri had refused her. She had accepted his refusal then because she was not yet ready to understand the true implications of her desire. But time had changed her. Time had made her wise in ways that youth could never achieve. "I have kept records," Dmitri continued, opening the ancient box. Inside were journals, dozens of them, each one filled with meticulous handwriting spanning centuries. "I have documented every transformation I have witnessed, not the dramatic ones that appear in folklore and legend, the real ones. The psychological dissolution that occurs when consciousness stretches across decades and then centuries. The way humans begin to view other humans as mayflies, as momentary flickers of insignificance. The erosion of empathy that comes from watching generations repeat the same mistakes, the same wars, the same small tragedies." He pulled out a journal dated 1823 and read passages aloud. Accounts of a woman transformed in Vienna who had slowly lost the ability to care about individual human suffering because the collective suffering of humanity had become too vast to hold in a single mind. Another from 1956, describing a man who had attempted suicide 17 times, unable to bear the weight of his own existence, unable to find meaning in an eternity that stretched before him like an infinite desert. But, Dmitri said, and his voice shifted, became something softer. There is another category of entry, rare entries, entries about those who learn to transform their hunger into something else, who learn to use their eternity not as a curse, but as a canvas upon which to paint meaning. He showed her a journal dated 1743, written in a handwriting so beautiful it seemed almost calligraphic. The entries described a woman named Catherine, who had decided that if she was cursed to live forever, she would dedicate that forever to the service of others. She had worked as a nurse, a teacher, a healer. She had saved thousands of lives over her extended existence, and in saving those lives, she had saved herself. That woman survived 732 years, Dmitri said quietly. And when she finally chose to end her existence, she did so not out of despair, but out of a sense that she had completed her work, that she had loved enough, served enough, witnessed enough. Her final entry read, "I am ready to rest. I have finally earned the right to sleep." Elena took the journal and held it against her chest. Tears were streaming down her face now, not tears of fear, but tears of recognition. This was what she wanted, not immortality for its own sake, but immortality with purpose. Immortality as a tool for love rather than as a sentence. "There is something else you should know," Dmitri continued. "The transformation will not happen all at once. It will be gradual. Over the course of the next several years, you will begin to notice changes. Your metabolism will slow. Your need for sleep will diminish. Your connection to the cycles of human time, days, seasons, years, will become attenuated. You will begin to perceive reality differently, to see the layers beneath surface experience, to understand the invisible structures that hold the world together." He moved closer to her, and in the moonlight, his face seemed almost translucent. "And during this transformation, you will still be able to change your mind. If at any point the process becomes too much, if you decide that you do not want what I have become, I can help you find a different path. You would not become fully immortal, but you would not return to ordinary mortality either. You would become something else, a liminal being, existing between states, neither living nor dead, but something that partakes of both." Elena shook her head slowly. She had made her decision long ago, the night she first kissed him in the tower chamber. Everything since then had been confirmation rather than choice. She took his hand and placed it against her neck, over the carotid artery where her pulse beat with the steady rhythm of finite existence. "Do it," she said. "Make me eternal. Make me part of your night. Make me something that will love you when humanity has forgotten what love means." Dmitri's entire body went rigid. He had waited 3 years for this moment, had prepared himself for it, had written contingency plans in the journals he kept hidden in the tower. But nothing could have prepared him for the actual weight of the choice, the actual reality of what he was about to do. He leaned closer, and Elena felt his breath, cold as January, empty as tombs. She felt his lips against her skin, so gentle they seemed almost apologetic. And then she felt his teeth, sharp and ancient and carrying the weight of all the centuries they had been used. The bite was not painful. It was revelation. It was the opening of a door that had been sealed since her birth. It was the moment where one form of existence ended and another began, not gradually or tentatively, but with the sudden and terrible certainty of transformation. She felt his hunger finally unleashed, drawing from her the vital essence that defined her as living. But it was not a hunger that destroyed. It was a hunger that elevated, that transformed, that took the ordinary substance of her blood and made it into something sacred, something eternal. And as she fell into the darkness of the transformation, Elena's last conscious thought was gratitude. Gratitude that she had lit candles in forgotten cemeteries. Gratitude that she had caught the attention of an immortal who had learned to love. Gratitude that she had been chosen for eternity by someone who understood that eternity's only real value was the opportunity to love one more day, one more century, one more lifetime beyond the boundary of death. 50 years passed, like pages turning in a book written in a language only the dead could read. Elena emerged from her transformation, changed but not destroyed. The process had taken exactly 4 years and 17 days. Dmitri had marked each one in his journals with the meticulous precision of someone documenting a resurrection. The physical transformation had been accompanied by a psychological one far more profound and far more troubling. For the first year, she had wanted to hunt. The hunger that Dmitri had managed to sublimate through centuries of discipline was for Elena a new and overwhelming force. She had killed, not humans, but animals. Deer in the forest beyond the monastery, rabbits in the fields, birds that she caught with reflexes that seemed to operate independently of her conscious will. Dmitri had not condemned her for this. He had simply waited, understanding that every newly made vampire had to travel through their own darkness before they could emerge into something approximating enlightenment. By the second year, Elena had learned to control the hunger. More than that, she had learned to understand it, to recognize it not as a voice commanding her to kill, but as a sensation, a presence, something that could be acknowledged and negotiated with rather than obeyed. She began to fast for weeks at a time, sustaining herself on the smallest possible quantities of blood, pushing herself to the edge of agony to prove that she could transcend the biological imperative that defined her new existence. Dmitri watched this self-mortification with concern. He had seen it before in newly transformed immortals, the belief that they could transcend their nature through sheer force of will. It usually ended in tragedy. Either the vampire descended into despair and sought the sunlight, or they overcorrected and became so engorged with hunger that they lost all sense of ethics and identity. "You are punishing yourself," he said one evening as Elena sat in the tower chamber, her face pale and drawn from weeks of self-imposed starvation. "That is not enlightenment. That is self-hatred wearing the mask of spiritual discipline." Elena looked at him, with eyes that had begun to glow faintly with the inner luminescence that marked all ancient vampires. "I do not want to become like the creatures I read about in your journals. I do not want to become someone who views humanity as prey. I would rather starve forever than betray the values that made me human in the first place." Dmitri sat beside her and took her hand. Her skin was cold now, cold as his own, and this similarity between them was both comforting and deeply melancholic. The values that made you human were not rejection of appetite. They were kindness in the face of hunger. They were the ability to choose mercy over survival. And mercy, Elena, sometimes means allowing yourself to live, to feed, to sustain your existence so that you can continue to serve the purposes you have committed yourself to. He stood and left the tower, returning an hour later with a gift, a small ceramic cup filled with blood. Human blood, he explained. From a blood bank where he had contacts, blood that had been given voluntarily by donors and would otherwise have been discarded. "This is a compromise," he said, "not the hunt, not the struggle, but sustenance. Drink this and understand that you can feed without becoming a monster, that you can survive without surrendering your humanity." Elena drank, and the relief that flooded through her was so intense it brought tears, tears that came less frequently now as her body adjusted to its new nature. The blood tasted of copper and salt and something else, something like memory, like the lives of all the people who had donated it contained within every drop. By the third year of her transformation, Elena had stabilized. She had found a rhythm that worked for her, fasting most of the time, feeding rarely but sufficiently, using her immortal existence not as an opportunity for indulgence, but as an extended mission. She began to work with Dmitri to establish what they called the sanctuary, a place where other supernatural beings, caught between states and struggling with their own transformations, could come for guidance and support. The first to arrive was a woman named Sophia, who had been transformed by a rogue vampire 30 years prior, but had managed to escape. She arrived at the monastery half-mad, carrying wounds both physical and psychological. Elena took one look at her and recognized something of her former self, the desperate need to find meaning in a cursed existence. "How do you bear it?" Sophia asked one night, as Elena tended to her wounds with herbal remedies and the kind of patient care that only someone who had recently walked the same path could provide. "By understanding that bearing it is not the point," Elena replied. "The point is to transform your curse into purpose. Yes, I am immortal. Yes, I will watch everyone I love eventually die. But in the meantime, I can ease their suffering. I can bear witness to their lives. I can create beauty and meaning in the spaces between despair and hope." Over the following decades, others came. An angel with wings that had been burned away, searching for redemption. A demon attempting to escape the cycle of cruelty that defined his existence. A human on the threshold of transformation, uncertain whether to take the final step. And Dmitri and Elena received them all with the same combination of compassion and unflinching honesty. Dmitri, who had lived 250 years in isolation and increasingly believed that his existence was punishment without purpose, found that his eternity had finally been given meaning. Not through philosophy or individual achievement, but through the simple act of witnessing others' transformations and helping them navigate the terrible wisdom that comes with living longer than any human lifespan should allow. Elena, who had been born voiceless and spent her childhood in an orphanage designed to break spirits, discovered that her silence had been a gift all along. She could listen in a way that few could. She could sit with someone's despair without trying to fix it or rationalize it away. She could simply be present, fully, completely, eternally present, in a way that the living, always conscious of their approaching death, could never quite achieve. On the 50th anniversary of Elena's transformation, they returned to the cemetery where they had first met. The place had become something like a pilgrimage site, though only those who knew how to look would have recognized it as such. The graves Elena had tended in her youth were still there, still marked with flowers and candles, still honored despite the decades that had passed. They stood in the clearing at midnight, and Dmitri pulled a new journal from the leather satchel he carried. Inside, he had written the story of Elena's transformation, not as a case study in supernatural biology, but as a love story, or perhaps more accurately, as a story about how love transforms the very nature of existence itself. "I have been thinking," Dmitri said, as they watched the candles flicker in the wind, "about what you asked me 50 years ago, whether I believed you would have regretted the transformation, whether you would have eventually resented me for making you immortal." Elena turned to him, and in the candlelight, her face appeared ageless and infinitely wise. The rough quality her voice had possessed in her early years of vocal recovery had smoothed out into something almost musical, though still carrying undertones of the silence that had once defined her. "Do you still wonder?" she asked. "No," Dmitri said, "because I have watched you become something I could never have predicted. You have not become a version of me, some pale copy of an immortal who learned to transcend his hunger. Instead, you have become something entirely new, a bridge between the living and the eternal, a guardian of souls in transition, a priestess of mercy who has taught me that love is not about duration, but about depth." They walked through the cemetery together, and as they walked, they noticed something beautiful. New graves had appeared, graves for people who had come to the sanctuary and, in finding peace and purpose, had eventually chosen to end their existence, choosing to sleep the eternal sleep when they had finally completed their work. Elena had not killed them, nor had Dmitri. They had simply provided the space where those exhausted by their own eternity could choose to rest. "This is what I want to be remembered for," Elena said softly. "Not as a vampire, not as an immortal, but as someone who helped the eternally burdened find peace, as someone who transformed her curse into service." They spent the rest of the night in the tower chamber, where it had all begun 50 years ago. The room was different now. It contained maps, journals, photographs, records of every person who had come to the sanctuary seeking guidance. It had become an archive of supernatural transformation, a library of the damned learning to find grace. As dawn approached, a dawn that they would not see, for the sun was no longer a part of their world, Dmitri reached for Elena's hand. "Thank you," he said. And the words, so simple and so inadequate to express what he felt, contained 50 years of gratitude and recognition and love transformed into something eternal. Elena squeezed his hand, and in that simple gesture existed an entire universe of understanding. They had found each other in a cemetery for the forgotten, and in finding each other, they had discovered that immortality's only real currency was the capacity to love something more than oneself, to love it so completely that eternity became not a punishment, but a canvas upon which to paint infinite variations of mercy and witness. Outside the monastery, the world continued its rotation, indifferent to vampire or mortal, to love stories or tragic endings. But in the tower, in the sanctuary, in the cemetery still tended by hands that would never age and hearts that would never stop beating, there existed a small pocket of grace, a refuge for those caught between life and death, a testament to the proposition that love could transform not just individuals, but the very nature of eternity itself. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned.